If she had turned the key 5 seconds earlier, she would have been gone. If the rain hadn't softened the sound of her own footsteps on the cracked asphalt, she would never have heard the whisper of pain from the alley. But destiny, on that Tuesday night, had other plans for Lena Washington. The bolt on the roll-down door of her garage was halfway home when a sound, thin as a wire, cut through the drumming of the downpour. It wasn't a cry for help, not a shout of anger. It was the quiet, involuntary sound of a body giving up. Lena froze, her hand hovering over the cold metal lock. Every instinct screamed at her to finish the job, to slide the bolt home and disappear into the safety of her small apartment above the shop. The neighborhood was a tapestry of hushed dangers after dark, a place where seeing nothing and hearing nothing were survival skills passed down through generations. But her father's voice, a ghost that lived between the scent of motor oil and worn-out tires, echoed in her mind. A good mechanic, he used to say, his knuckles scarred and permanently stained, doesn't just fix what's broken. They listen for the sounds nobody else hears. She pulled her hand back, the decision a heavy weight settling in her gut. With a sigh that fogged in the damp air, she grabbed the heaviest wrench from the toolbox just inside the door and stepped out into the rain. The alley was a canyon of wet brick and overflowing dumpsters. The city lights cast a sickly orange glow on the slick pavement. There, slumped against the wall, was a man. He was a silhouette of ruin, his impeccable suit ruined by mud and something darker, something that steamed faintly in the cold. His head was bowed, his black hair plastered to his forehead. Lena's breath caught. This was not a neighborhood drunk or a man down on his luck. The cut of his suit, the gleam of a gold watch on his wrist even in the dim light, it all screamed of a world far removed from her own. He was bleeding. A lot. The dark stain was spreading from his side, a blossoming nightmare on the fine fabric. She took a step closer, the wrench feeling flimsy and useless. "Hey," she called out, her voice steadier than she felt.
"Mister?"
"You need an ambulance?"
He didn't move.
She crept closer still, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could see his face now, sharp and angular, pale as bone. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. Calling the police was the right thing to do, the sane thing to do. But the police in this part of town brought questions that honest people couldn't afford to answer. They brought trouble that lingered long after the sirens faded. She looked at the man, then back at the warm, greasy light of her garage. It was her sanctuary, the only thing in the world that was truly hers, bought with her sweat and her father's dreams. Bringing this man inside would be an act of madness. It would be inviting the storm, whatever storm had left him here, right over her threshold. But leaving him here to die in the rain, that felt like a different kind of ruin. Her father had never fixed a car without first listening. Lena knelt, the cold of the pavement seeping through her coveralls, and listened to the ragged sound of a stranger's breath. In that moment, the world shrank to a single, fragile choice. And she chose. With a grunt of exertion that seemed to tear through the quiet alley, Lena hooked her arms under the man's shoulders and began to drag him. He was heavier than he looked, a dead weight of muscle and bone. The metallic smell of blood was overpowering now, mingling with the scent of rain and garbage. Each step was a struggle, his expensive shoes scuffing a miserable path across the gritty asphalt. She hauled him over the threshold of her garage, the scrape of his body on the concrete a sound of finality. She kicked the roll-down door, and it came crashing down with a deafening clang, shutting out the night, the rain, and the world of sensible decisions. Inside, the garage was an organized chaos of tools, spare parts, and the half-disassembled engine of a vintage pickup truck. It smelled of oil, metal, and hard work. It was her haven. Tonight, it had become a field hospital. She laid him on a patch of relatively clean floor, his head resting on a folded-up tarp. The single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling cast harsh shadows across his face, highlighting the tension in his jaw even in unconsciousness. For a moment, she just stood there, breathing heavily, rain dripping from her hair onto the dusty floor. The sheer insanity of her actions washed over her. Who was this man? What had he done? And more importantly, What would the people who did this to him do when they came looking? Her gaze fell to the wound in his side. She wasn't a doctor, but she knew enough to see it was bad. A deep, ugly gash that was still weeping blood. Panic began to bubble in her chest, hot and sharp. But then she caught sight of her own hands, calloused, stained with grease, the nails clipped short. They were capable hands. They could take an engine apart and put it back together. They could diagnose a problem from a single, subtle sound. Surely they could handle this. She grabbed her emergency first aid kit from under the workbench, the one meant for sliced fingers and minor burns, not gunshot wounds or knife attacks. It was pitifully inadequate. Inside were antiseptic wipes, gauze, medical tape, and a bottle of cheap whiskey her father had kept for medicinal purposes. It would have to do. Kneeling beside him, she gently, carefully, began to cut away the ruined fabric of his shirt and suit jacket. The material was fine silk and wool, impossibly soft under her rough fingers, a stark contrast to the brutal injury it concealed. As she worked, she saw more than just the main wound. His knuckles were bruised and split, a map of a recent, violent struggle. A dark purple contusion was blooming along his jawline. This man was a fighter. Or he had been, before he ended up bleeding out in her alley. She cleaned the wound as best she could with the antiseptic wipes, her touch surprisingly gentle. He groaned, a low rumble of pain, and his eyes fluttered open for a second. They were dark, intensely dark, and for a fleeting moment, they were lucid. They held a flicker of confusion, then suspicion, before glazing over again. Lena's heart leaped into her throat. "It's okay," she whispered, the words feeling thin and useless. "You're safe. Just hold still." She wasn't sure if he heard her, or if she was just trying to convince herself. She poured a little of the whiskey onto a clean rag, the fumes stinging her eyes, and pressed it against the gash. He arched his back with a strangled cry, his body going rigid. She held him down with one hand, her own muscles straining. "I'm sorry," she murmured, her voice tight with a mixture of pity and fear. "I'm so sorry, but I have to." After cleaning it, she packed the wound with gauze and taped it down tight, a clumsy but firm field dressing. His breathing seemed to even out slightly. Exhausted, she sat back on her heels, the empty whiskey bottle rolling away on the floor. The man was a stranger, a harbinger of untold trouble, but as he lay there, vulnerable and breathing, a fragile connection had been forged in blood and desperation. She had crossed a line. There was no going back to the life she had known just an hour ago. The garage, once her fortress, now felt like a cage she had willingly locked herself into, with a tiger sleeping in the corner. He woke to the smell of brewing coffee and the dull, throbbing ache in his side. For a disoriented moment, Kwon Jin-woo didn't know where he was. The ceiling was a web of steel beams and exposed pipes. The air was thick with a scent of oil and metal. He tried to sit up, but a bolt of white-hot pain shot through his torso, forcing him back down with a gasp. That's when he saw her. She was standing by a small hot plate in the corner, her back to him. A young woman, tall and slender, wearing a dark blue mechanic's uniform that seemed a size too big for her frame. Her hair was pulled back in a tight bun, revealing the graceful line of her neck. He watched her, his senses on high alert. He catalogued every detail, the worn-out soles of her work boots, the focused set of her shoulders as she poured coffee into a chipped ceramic mug, the quiet efficiency of her movements. She wasn't a threat, his instincts told him, but she was an unknown quantity, and in his world, the unknown was always dangerous. Lena felt his eyes on her. She turned slowly, the mug of coffee warming her hands. She had been awake all night, watching him, her mind racing. Now, faced with his conscious gaze, she felt a fresh wave of fear. His eyes were as dark and sharp as she remembered, but now they were clear, intelligent, and intensely analytical. They were the eyes of a predator. "You're awake," she said, her voice coming out as a little more than a croak. She cleared her throat. "I made coffee," he didn't respond. He just watched her, his expression unreadable. She walked over and knelt a careful distance away, placing the mug on the floor beside him. You should drink something. And I have some broth. If you can keep it down. His eyes flickered down to the crude bandage on his side, then back to her face.
Who are you? He asked.
His voice was a low rasp, laced with an accent she couldn't quite place. My name is Lena. Why did you help me? The question was direct, stripped of any pleasantry. It demanded a real answer. Lena thought for a moment, her gaze drifting around the garage. It was more than a place of work. It was a library of her life. Over by the tool chest was the den her father had kicked into it the day the bank sent the first foreclosure notice. The faded calendar on the wall was from the year he died, a month she could never bring herself to tear away. This place was built on the back of his sacrifice, and now it rested on hers. She worked 16-hour days, fixing the cars of people who had more than she did, just to keep the roof over her head, just to honor his memory. You were hurt, she finally said, meeting his gaze. I couldn't just leave you there. It was the simplest truth. For her, it was a moral absolute, as fundamental as the fact that an engine needed spark and fuel to run. For him, it seemed to be a foreign concept. He processed her answer in silence, his calculating gaze never leaving her. He was a man accustomed to transactions, to motives, to debts owed and paid. Simple, unprompted kindness was a currency he didn't trade in. He saw the poverty in the worn tools, the patched-up walls, the threadbare state of her uniform. She had nothing. Why would she risk what little she had for a stranger? You should have called the police, he stated, testing her. Thought about it, she admitted with a shrug. But they cause more problems than they solve around here. Figured you had enough problems already. A flicker of something. Surprise? Respect crossed his face before his mask of stoicism slipped back into place. He reached for the coffee, his movements slow and pained. He took a sip, the warmth spreading through him. He still didn't know who she was, not really. But he knew one thing. She was brave. Or she was a fool. In his experience, the two were often the same. Days bled into one another, forming a strange, suspended reality within the four walls of the garage. A quiet routine began to take shape, an unspoken rhythm between the wounded man and his reluctant caretaker. Lena would work on the old pickup truck during the day, the clang of her tools and the hum of the radio a constant backdrop. He, who she still only knew as the silent man, would watch her from his makeshift bed on the floor. He never offered to help, but his attention was absolute. He watched the way her brow furrowed in concentration as she puzzled over a tricky bit of wiring. He watched the fluid, practiced way she handled heavy tools, her movements economical and precise. He learned the landscape of her life through observation. She ate cheap canned soup and crackers for lunch. She hummed softly when a difficult part finally clicked into place, and she always cleaned her tools meticulously before hanging them back on the pegboard at the end of the day. Lena, in turn, learned him through his silences. She learned that he preferred his coffee black, that he refused any pain medication stronger than aspirin, and that the shadows in his eyes deepened whenever a police siren wailed in the distance. She changed his dressing every morning, a clinical and tense ritual. Her hands would be gentle but firm, and he would remain perfectly still, his jaw tight, enduring the pain without a sound. It was during these moments that the wall between them felt thinnest. She was close enough to see the small scar that cut through his left eyebrow, to feel the heat radiating from his skin. You're healing well, she said one morning, taping a fresh bandage in place. He grunted in response. You should have been a doctor. Nah, she said, pulling back. I like it when my patients can't talk back. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, a fleeting, almost imperceptible thing, but it was there. It was the first time she had seen anything other than pain or suspicion on his face. The small moment of warmth was a crack of light in the tense atmosphere. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, a storm was raging. In a penthouse office overlooking the glittering skyline, a man named Mr. Park slammed his fist on a mahogany desk. The room was filled with men in sharp suits, all of them standing with their heads bowed. Find him, Mr. Park roared, his voice echoing off the floor-to-ceiling windows. He vanishes into thin, air after a meeting with the triad? It was an ambush. A betrayal. Someone in this room is a rat, and when I find out who, I will peel the skin from their bones. The men flinched but remained silent. The disappearance of their boss, Kwon Jin-woo, had sent the entire organization into a tailspin. Power vacuums were forming. Old rivalries were resurfacing. The empire he had built with disciplined brutality was beginning to fracture at the seams. Mr. Park, his most loyal and feared lieutenant, was trying to hold it all together, but his methods were brute force and paranoia. He dispatched search parties across the city, shaking down informants, leaning on contacts, turning the criminal underworld upside down in his desperate, violent search. Every passing hour made him more certain that Jin-woo was dead, and his hunt for his boss was slowly morphing into a hunt for the traitors responsible. Back in the quiet, oil-scented garage, Jin-woo felt the distant tremors of his collapsing world. He was cut off, isolated, and for the first time in a decade, completely powerless. All he could do was heal and watch the unassuming woman who had become his entire world. He was a king in exile, his kingdom in turmoil, and his only subject was a mechanic who had no idea who she was harboring. The quiet peace of the garage was a fragile illusion, and he knew, with chilling certainty, that it was about to be shattered. The knock on the garage door was so loud and sudden it made Lena drop a socket wrench with a clatter. Her heart instantly seized. In the strange bubble of her life for the past week, she had almost forgotten that an outside world existed. Jin-woo, who had been sitting up against a stack of tires, was instantly on his feet, his body tense and coiled despite the pull of his wound. His eyes darted to the door, then to her, a silent question in his gaze.
Lena, you in there?
Open up, girl. I brought you lunch. The voice was familiar, cheerful, and utterly harmless. It's Chloe, Lena breathed, a wave of relief so powerful it made her knees weak. She shot Jin-woo a look that said stay put and be quiet before sliding a heavy toolbox in front of the corner where he was hidden. She took a deep breath and rolled the door up just enough to slip through. Chloe stood there, a wide grin on her face, holding up a paper bag that smelled deliciously of fried chicken. She was Lena's oldest friend, the only person who had stuck by her after her father died and the bills started piling up. I haven't seen you in days, Chloe said, her smile fading slightly as she took in Lena's pale face and the dark circles under her eyes. Everything okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. Just been working late, Lena lied, forcing a smile. That old Ford is giving me a run for my money. She tried to take the bag, intending to make a quick exit, but Chloe, ever perceptive, peered past her into the dim garage. Smells different in here, she noted, wrinkling her nose. Less like grease, more like antiseptic. And is that soup I smell? Before Lena could stop her, Chloe ducked under her arm and slipped inside. Lord, Lena, you really need to get some more light in. She stopped dead. Her eyes, wide as saucers, were fixed on the corner of the garage. Jin-woo had moved slightly, and his foot was visible from behind the toolbox. Chloe's gaze traveled from the expensive leather shoe to the rumpled blanket to the empty soup bowl on the floor. Her brain, Lena could see, was putting the pieces together with horrifying speed. You have a man in here, Chloe whispered, her voice a mixture of shock and accusation. Lena Washington, you have a whole wounded man living in your garage. Have you lost your mind? Sure. Keep your voice down, Lena hissed, pulling her friend further inside and letting the door rumble shut. Jin-woo stepped out from behind the toolbox. If Chloe was shocked before, she was terrified now. She looked at his bruised face, his cold, intimidating stare, and the way he held himself like a coiled snake, and she took a step back, bumping into a stack of tires. Who is he? Chloe stammered, her eyes darting between Lena and the dangerous-looking stranger. Before Lena could invent another lie, Jin-woo saw the headline on a newspaper sticking out of Chloe's tote bag. His picture was on the front page, a grainy black-and-white photo from a security camera. The headline read, Crime Syndicate Power Vacuum. Boss Kwon Jin-woo presumed dead after gang war erupts, his face hardened into a mask of cold fury. The illusion of his anonymous safety was gone. He looked directly at Lena, his dark eyes holding hers. The time for secrets was over. "My name is Kwon Jinwoo," he said, his voice low and steady, each word landing like a stone. "And the people who are looking for me are not the police. By helping me, you have put a target on your own back. You are in terrible danger." Chloe let out a small squeak. Lena felt the floor drop out from under her. It wasn't just trouble she had brought into her garage. It was a war. The revelation of his name changed everything. The silence in the garage was no longer peaceful. It was heavy with unspoken fear. Kwon Jinwoo was no longer just a wounded stranger. He was a name from a newspaper headline, a ghost from a world of violence she couldn't comprehend. Lena found herself looking at him differently, seeing the lethal potential that lay dormant beneath his calm exterior. The way he moved, the cold assessment in his eyes, it all made a terrifying kind of sense now. Chloe, for her part, was a nervous wreck. "You have to get him out of here, Lena," she pleaded in a hushed, frantic tone later that day, after Jinwoo had retreated to his corner. "A mafia boss? Are you kidding me? They'll kill you just for being in the same room with him." "And what am I supposed to do, Chloe?" Lena shot back, her voice tight with stress. "Throw him back out in the alley? He's still hurt. He can barely walk. That is not your problem. Your problem is staying alive and keeping this garage, which is more than you can say if his enemies show up." The argument was circular and exhausting. In the end, Chloe left, promising to keep her mouth shut but looking at Lena with a new, worried pity. The bond of their friendship was strained by a secret too dangerous to share. As if on cue, the outside world began to press in. The neighborhood, a place of porous secrets and watchful eyes, had started to notice things. Mrs. Gable from next door, who watered her wilting petunias with religious zeal, saw the extra food Lena was buying. Mr. Henderson, the mailman, noted that Lena seemed jumpy, always peering out before opening the door. Whispers began to slither through the community like weeds. "Did you see that man with Lena? He looks dangerous. I heard she's mixed up in something bad. Drugs, maybe." People she had known her whole life began to cross the street to avoid her. Customers who had been loyal for years suddenly found other mechanics. The garage, once a hub of neighborhood life, grew quiet and still. The pressure peaked when her landlord, a portly man named Mr. Davies with a perpetually sour expression, showed up. He didn't just want the rent, which was a week late. He wanted answers. "I'm hearing things, Lena," he said, his little eyes scanning the garage suspiciously. "Things about a man staying here. You know that's a violation of your lease." "This is a commercial property. I'm just helping out a friend who's down on his luck," Lena said, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. "He'll be gone in a day or two." "He'd better be," Mr. Davies sneered. "Because the rent is due, and I'm not running a charity. Or a halfway house for criminals. You have 1 week to pay up and get him out, or I'm starting eviction proceedings." He stormed off, leaving Lena shaking with a mixture of anger and despair. Jinwoo had heard every word from the back of the shop. He emerged from the shadows, his face a grim, unreadable mask. He saw the sheen of unshed tears in her eyes, saw the tremor in her hands as she clenched them into fists. He had spent his life cultivating power, building an empire on a foundation of fear and control. Yet here, in this small, greasy room, he was the source of her ruin. His presence, which should have guaranteed safety, was poisoning her life, turning her neighbors against her and threatening to take away the only thing she had left. "This is my fault," he said, his voice rough. "I will not let you lose this place because of me." Lena looked up at him, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and defiance. "And where will you go? You can't even make it to the end of the block." "I will handle it," he said, a dangerous glint returning to his eyes. For the first time since he'd arrived, he looked less like a patient and more like the ruthless boss from the headlines. The quiet sanctuary of the garage had become a prison, and the walls were closing in on them both. The air grew thick with a tension that was almost suffocating. Every passing car that slowed down on the street outside sent a jolt of adrenaline through Lena. She stopped sleeping, her nights spent listening to the sounds of the city, imagining footsteps in the alley, waiting for the violence of Jinwoo's world to finally smash through her door. Jinwoo, too, was on edge. He was healing, his movements becoming surer and quicker, but he was a caged lion, pacing the confines of the garage. He felt the net tightening. His enemies weren't fools. They would be methodical, sweeping the city grid by grid. It was only a matter of time. The danger arrived not with a bang, but with a quiet, menacing presence. It was late afternoon when a sleek black sedan, its windows tinted to an impenetrable darkness, rolled slowly down her street. It was completely out of place among the battered pickup trucks and aging family cars of the neighborhood. It drove past the garage once, then circled the block and came back, pausing for a beat directly in front of her roll-down door before continuing on. It was a clear message. They were closing in. "Get down," Jin-woo hissed, pulling Lena away from the small, grimy window of her office. His body shielded hers, and she could feel the hard-packed muscle of his back, the coiled readiness for a fight. "They're here." "Who?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Rivals. The ones who ambushed me." Fear, cold and absolute, washed over her. This was it. The abstract danger from the newspaper headlines was now parked on her street. She looked around her garage, at the tools that felt like extensions of her own hands, at the half-finished engine that held the promise of next month's rent. It all seemed so fragile, so easily destroyed. Jin-woo's face was a mask of cold concentration. He was no longer her patient. He was a commander assessing a battlefield. He moved to the back of the garage, prying loose a brick from the wall. Tucked inside the cavity was a small, oil-stained burner phone. He had hidden it there days ago, a contingency he hoped he would never need. With deft fingers, he punched in a number. The call was answered on the first ring. "It's me," Jin-woo said into the phone, his voice low and urgent. There was a pause, and even from across the room, Lena could hear the shocked, disbelieving voice on the other end. "They've found me. An auto shop on the corner of 14th and Eastgate. Send everyone." Now, he snapped the phone shut, broke it in half with his bare hands, and tossed the pieces into a barrel of waste oil. He turned to Lena, his eyes dark and serious. He walked over to her, placing his hands on her shoulders. His touch was surprisingly steady. "Lena, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Go into your apartment. Lock the door. Barricade it if you can. Do not open it for anyone. Do you understand? No matter what you hear, you do not come out." She wanted to argue, to say she wouldn't leave him, but the look in his eyes silenced her. It was an order, not a request. It was the command of a man used to being obeyed, a man who was about to go to war. She could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. She scrambled up the rickety stairs to her apartment, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She slammed the door, turned the deadbolt, and shoved a heavy bookshelf in front of it. Crouching on the floor, she peered through a crack in the blinds. The black sedan was back, and this time, it wasn't alone. Two more had joined it, boxing in the block. Men in dark suits were getting out, their movements sleek and predatory. They were spreading out, converging on her garage. Her sanctuary. Her home. Down below, Jin-woo picked up the heaviest wrench from her workbench. It felt clumsy and inadequate in his hand, a poor substitute for the weapons he was used to. He stood in the center of the garage, alone, wounded king ready to defend his borrowed castle, and waited for the door to break. The sound of heavy boots on the asphalt outside was a drumbeat counting down the final seconds. Lena watched from her window, her hand pressed against her mouth to stifle a scream. The men from the sedans moved with a chilling, coordinated grace, their dark suits a stark uniform against the gritty backdrop of her neighborhood. They weren't just thugs, they were soldiers. One of them, a man with a cruel scar down his face, barked an order, and two of his men began to work on the garage door lock. Downstairs, Jin-woo stood perfectly still. He closed his eyes for a second, his senses expanding to fill the space. He could hear the scrape of a lockpick, the distant wail of a siren from another part of the city, the frantic beat of his own heart. He was outnumbered, unarmed, and not yet at full strength. The odds were impossible. But he was Kwon Jin-woo. He did not know how to surrender. The lock clicked. The heavy roll-down door began to groan as they forced it upward. A sliver of fading daylight cut across the oily floor, widening as the door rose. Just as the first man ducked under the rising door, a screech of tires tore through the air. A convoy of black SUVs, appearing as if from thin air, swarmed the street from both ends. They boxed in the sedans, doors flying open before the vehicles had even stopped moving. Men poured out, dressed in suits as sharp as those of the attackers, but they moved with a different kind of energy, not of predation, but of disciplined loyalty. At their head was Mr. Park. He stepped out of the lead vehicle, his face a thundercloud of fury and relief. He saw the rival gang members, frozen in surprise, and then his eyes locked on the figure standing alone in the garage. "Boss," he breathed, the word a mixture of reverence and disbelief. The standoff was electric. The two groups faced each other across the 20 feet of pavement, a silent war of glares and postures. The scarred man's crew was outnumbered 3-1. He spat on the ground, issued a sharp command, and his men scrambled back into their cars. With a squeal of tires, they were gone. Mr. Park and his men flooded into the garage, their weapons now lowered. They surrounded Jinwoo, a wall of protection forming around their returned leader. Mr. Park's gaze swept over the scene, the makeshift bed, the first aid supplies, the humble surroundings. Then his eyes landed on the stairway leading to the apartment, and he saw the flicker of movement behind the blinds. His face hardened with suspicion. "Who is in there?" he demanded. Jinwoo held up a hand, and his men fell silent. He looked up toward the window where he knew Lena was watching, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. He then turned to face his second-in-command, his voice ringing with an authority that had been absent for weeks. "This place," he said, his voice echoing in the suddenly quiet garage, "is a sanctuary. The woman who lives here saved my life." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. He looked each of his men in the eye, his gaze lingering on Mr. Park. "She is not a target. She is not a complication. She is under my protection. Anyone who harms her or threatens this place will answer to me directly. Is that understood?" A murmur of assent went through the ranks. Mr. Park, his face a complex mask of shock, suspicion, and dawning understanding, gave a stiff, formal bow. "Yes, boss." "It is understood." From her window, Lena watched the entire exchange. She saw the raw power Jinwoo commanded, the instant obedience he inspired. She saw the hostile, assessing look from the man called Mr. Park transform into grudging acceptance. The entire neighborhood, drawn out by the commotion, witnessed it too. They saw the army of men in suits, the display of fearsome loyalty, and they saw it all centered on the quiet mechanic they had been whispering about. In that moment, Lena Washington was no longer a pariah. She was untouchable. The aftermath of the confrontation was a whirlwind. Jinwoo's men, efficient and silent, secured the area. Mr. Park, after a brief, hushed conversation with his boss, began issuing a stream of orders into his phone, reasserting control over their fractured empire. The neighborhood gossips, who had been watching from their porches and windows, slowly retreated back into their homes, their minds reeling with what they had just witnessed. The whispers about Lena being in trouble were replaced by awestruck murmurs about her mysterious, powerful protector. She was no longer a subject of pity or suspicion. She was a figure of intrigue and respect. Lena finally unlocked her apartment door and came down the stairs, her legs unsteady. She walked into the garage, which was now filled with imposing men in dark suits who parted before her like the sea. They looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and deference. Her eyes found Jinwoo, who was standing in the center of it all, looking every bit the commander he was. He dismissed his men with a curt nod, leaving just him and a still wary Mr. Park. "You should go," Lena said to Jinwoo, her voice quiet but firm. "It's not safe for you here anymore. They know where to find you. They will not dare to return," Jinwoo stated simply. It wasn't a boast, it was a fact. "This place is now the safest in the city for you." He then turned to Mr. Park and spoke in rapid, fluent Korean. Mr. Park listened, nodded, and left without another word. A few hours later, A quiet, unassuming man in a simple gray suit arrived. He introduced himself as an accountant. He met with Lena in her small office, the space seeming to shrink around his professional presence. He spoke about an anonymous benefactor who wished to express their gratitude for a recent act of kindness. He presented her with a folder. Inside was the deed to the garage and the small apartment above it. It was paid in full. The mountain of debt her father had left behind, the weight that had pressed down on her every single day, was gone.
Just like that.
Her hands trembled as she held the papers. She looked through the office window at Jinwoo, who was standing near the entrance of the garage, his back to her, looking out at the street as if standing guard. It was too much. The relief was so immense, so sudden, that it felt like a physical blow. This building wasn't just wood and brick to her. It was her father's legacy, her entire life's work, her future. And it was now hers, truly and completely hers. Later that evening, after the accountant had left, the garage was quiet again. Jinwoo walked over to her. He didn't say anything about the deed, about the money. He simply looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face. "Thank you, Lena," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "You gave me back my life. You didn't have to do that," she whispered, clutching the folder to her chest. "The garage, it's too much. It is not enough," he replied, his gaze intense. "A debt like the one I owe you can never be fully repaid. But it is a start." He took a step closer. The air between them crackled with a new kind of tension, something that went beyond danger and gratitude. It was something more fragile, more personal. "My world is complicated and violent," he said. "But I am no longer safe here, and you are no longer safe without me. Come with me, Lena." It wasn't a command.
It was a plea.
An invitation into a world she couldn't imagine, offered by a man who was both her savior and the source of all her danger. A life of quiet, desperate struggle had just ended. A new one, terrifying and uncertain, was waiting for her to choose it. Lena stood in the center of her garage, the crisp legal papers still in her hand. The air, for the first time in years, felt light in her lungs. The familiar scent of motor oil and steel was no longer tinged with the metallic tang of fear or the bitter aroma of impending debt. It was the smell of home. Her home. Jinwoo waited by the doorway, a patient silhouette against the encroaching twilight. He had offered her an escape, a new life wrapped in the dangerous glamour of his world. It was a world of power, of wealth, of men who obeyed his every command. It was everything her life was not. But as she looked around the garage, at the neatly organized tools hanging on the pegboard, at the grease stains on the floor that told stories of 1,000 different repairs, she knew she couldn't simply leave it all behind. This place wasn't a cage she needed escaping from. It was her anchor. It was the testament to her father's love and her own resilience. It was who she was. She walked over to him, her steps sure and steady on the concrete floor she now owned. She stopped in front of him, close enough to see the exhaustion that still lingered in the corners of his eyes, the faint scar above his brow. "I can't leave this place," she said, her voice clear and without a trace of doubt. "It's a part of me." A flicker of disappointment crossed his face, but he nodded in understanding. "I would not ask you to give up who you are, but I will come with you," she continued, and his head snapped up, his dark eyes locking onto hers. On one condition he waited, his expression guarded. "This," she said, holding up the keys to the garage, "this stays mine. My name stays on that deed. Whatever happens in your world, whatever I become a part of, I need to know this is still here. That I am still Lena Washington." The mechanic, a slow, genuine smile spread across Jinwoo's face. It transformed him, erasing the last traces of the ruthless Mafia boss and revealing the man underneath. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated respect. "Your terms are accepted," he said, his voice warm. He held out his hand. She looked at it for a moment, the hand of a killer, a kingpin, a man of immense power, and then she placed her own calloused, grease-stained hand in his. His grip was firm, protective. They stood there for a long moment, two worlds colliding in the quiet of a humble garage. The debt between them had been paid, not with money, but with a mutual act of salvation. Kindness, she realized, was a language even a man like him could understand. It was a debt that could never be fully repaid, only honored. As they stepped out into the night, a black SUV pulling up silently to the curb, Lena took one last look back at the garage. The light she had left on inside cast a warm, golden glow, a beacon of the life she had fought so hard for. She was not leaving it behind. She was taking it with her. The door of the SUV closed, sealing them in. The vehicle pulled away from the curb, melting into the city traffic. Their journey together was just beginning. The storm she had invited over her threshold had passed, but she knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and thrilling, that she was now heading directly into its eye. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of the rain. Destiny had not been finished with her that night in the alley, and she had a feeling it was just getting started.